Welcome to Coastal Matters. I'm Charlie Walters. My guest today is Cornelia Dean. She is a science writer and the former science editor of the New York Times. Her career is focused on communicating about science herself and also helping scientists learn to communicate effectively with wider audiences. She wrote the award-winning Against the Tide, The Battle for America's Beaches in 1999. She also wrote in 2009, Am I Making Myself Clear? A Scientist's Guide to Talking to the Public. She has taught at Harvard, Columbia, Vassar, the University of Rhode Island, and she's currently a writer in residence at Brown University in Providence. Thank you for doing this, Corey, especially on a nice sunny day.
Thank you for having me.
In your book, Against the Tide, you start the book by talking about a severe storm that hit Galveston, Texas in 1900. And more important in the context of our discussion, what happened in the aftermath of that storm. Can you talk about that?
Sure. The hurricane of 1900 in Galveston remains the deadliest natural disaster ever in the United States. And about probably a quarter of the city's population died in that storm, 6,000 people at least. And there was a lot of talk after the storm had passed whether Galveston should just move inland. And Galveston was a major, major city at that time, largest port west of the Mississippi and so on. But the people of Galveston said no, they wanted to stay where they were, and they built a seawall along the entire island that Galveston sits on, and they raised up the properties behind it to meet the level of the seawall, sometimes up to 17 feet higher than they were before.
When you say a seawall, what was that made out of?
It was concrete, it was curved, it ran parallel to the shore all the way along the island. Initially, in front of where the city of Galveston is, on the island itself, on Galveston Island itself, because of the way seawalls and water interact, the island around at the edges of the seawalls was flanked. It was carved out by waves, so they had to keep extending the wall, and they extended it and extended it and extended it, and today it runs almost the entire length of the island. But the price they paid in Galveston is they don't have much beach at all in front of the seawall. And in fact, there's so little beach in front of the seawall that they have to put piles of rocks at the foot of the seawall to maintain it in place. So they saved their city, but at the cost of their beach.
And explain the mechanics of how that happens. They put up a wall, now there's no beach. Why? Because
if you're in a situation where erosion is going on, and on the east and west and Gulf Coast of the United States, erosion is happening in about 90% of the stretches of coast. If you're in that kind of a situation and you put a wall and you're drawing a line in the sand, and the water is going to come up and up and up until it eventually hits your wall. It hits that line, and when that happens, the beach underneath it is drowned. This is called passive erosion, and it occurs almost everywhere people put walls up on the beach. The water eventually rises up to meet the wall, and then there's no more beach. I guess that's because normally people don't build walls unless they're in a situation where the water is coming in at them.
So if there is no barrier on a beach, the wave travels further away from the shoreline?
If there's no wall on the beach?
Yes.
Well, on a barrier island like Galveston, which are these thin ribbons of sand that run along the eastern Gulf Coast, on barrier islands like that, what happens naturally when the water is rising is that the island slowly shifts inland through a number of processes like overwash, inlet formation. All of these things contribute to the island shifting to higher ground by itself. So if you let the island do what it wants to do, the island will survive intact. It will just be moving slowly inland. The problem is when you want to hold the landscape in place, when the underlying situation is one of erosion. When you make that decision, you hold the island in place, the water keeps coming in, the island can't get out of its way, and the beach is drowned.
Applying this to Nantucket, there's one spot that comes to mind. If you look at old maps, when I say old, really as recently as 40 or 50 years, if you look at Great Point, you can see that over time the eastern side of Great Point has eroded. They had to move the lighthouse, or they had to rebuild one actually. But on the west side, it's accreting. So if you're looking at it, it's bending over a bit to the west because of just the process you're talking about.
That is the kind of thing that happens all the time on the coast, but ordinary people are not used to thinking of the landscape under their feet as being in motion. We think of terra firma as terra firma, and we don't make plans with the idea that this land may want to be somewhere else one day. And that is, I think, one of the main reasons why we get into trouble on the coast.
Now, when you have a wall, and it doesn't have to be a concrete wall, it could be other materials.
Yes, many other materials.
You're not just scooping out sand in front of the wall, but at either end of the wall, what happens where the wall ends?
What happens, well, so there are two questions here, is what happens when at the foot of the wall? And there are people still who will say that putting a wall in accelerates erosion at the foot of the wall. Their thinking is that in a natural beach, the waves run up and the water sort of percolates into the sand and then runs out again. Whereas on a beach with a wall, the water runs up, hits the wall, and bounces back with some force, taking more sand with us. That is not actually a known scientific fact yet on the coast. In fact, there are some studies that would contest it. However, at the ends of walls, the way the water acts at the end of a wall, we know now that it causes scouring. It causes sand to erode away at the end of the wall and sometimes behind on the landward side of the wall at the ends of the wall. And this is called flanking. It's extremely common.
Now, is flanking, when you talk about flanking, are you talking about a process that's being accelerated to scour the beaches, or is it a new process?
It's something that would not be happening if you hadn't put a wall there.
Now, aside from the concrete you mentioned for Galveston, what other kinds of armoring?
People have used at one time or another practically anything. Big piles of rock rubble called riprap. They use sheet piling, which is like gigantic corrugated metal piling that is driven straight into the ground. They build wooden bulkheads. People put Christmas trees on their beaches, which are just a way of trapping sand. One vivid example is when the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was threatened with falling into the ocean. People from the Park Service actually broke up the parking lot and took great chunks of asphalt from the parking lot and put it around the base of the lighthouse to protect it. So one time or another, people have put all kinds of things out as walls or quasi-walls against the rising sea. One thing that people are using in a lot of places now is sandbags. And some of them are enormous sandbags made of geotextile material that they put on along the beach. And they function more or less as a wall.
You know, of those things you named, and most if not all of them you can see somewhere on Nantucket, is anyone worse or better than another?
I'm not the person who can answer that question. I would say I don't have enough technical knowledge to answer that question.
You're not an engineer, in other words.
I'm not an engineer, I'm not a coastal geologist. I would say, though, that if you are on an eroding beach and you put a wall of any kind onto that beach, eventually you're going to lose your beach. I would say that's ordained by God in those circumstances.
Another approach to doing this you talk about in Against the Tide, and that's a groin. We do have some groins on Nantucket. What is a groin?
A groin, a lot of people call them jetties, but their correct name is groin. A groin is essentially a wall of rocks that goes out from the beach straight out into the water. And the usefulness of groins is based on the fact that sand is moving in currents along the shore, not in and out, but sideways along the shore all the time. This process depends on what the prevailing winds are wherever you are and so on, but there is something called net literal drift of sand. Over the course of a year, sand moves predominantly in one direction or another on the coast, on almost all stretches of coast. A groin, when you build this little wall of rocks out into the surf, the groin traps sand on one side or the other. If the sand is moving this way, for example, it traps the sand here. However, on the other side, that side is not getting sand that it would ordinarily have gotten, and so it's starved of sand, and it starts to erode even faster than it was before. And often what happens at that point is the person downdrift, the person who's losing sand, puts in her own groin to trap whatever sand is coming around. And when I was working on my book, one person I was talking to about groins said, groins are like lawyers. Once one person has one, everybody needs one. And you can sort of see how that can be true. But a beach that is lined with groins, going to that kind of a beach is not the same experience as going to a natural beach. I grew up with groins because the ocean beach that I went to as a child were the New Jersey ocean beaches, and they've been engineered for a long, long, long time. So I was used to it. I accepted it as part of beach life, but it doesn't have to be. And I have to say the beach is a lot nicer without that kind of thing, I think.
Well, there are several spots on the island where you can see groins and see what you're talking about. I was walking my dog one day a long time ago, and we came to a groin that was maybe this much out of the sand. Well, the dog didn't know that on the other side of the groin it was about this much, and the dog just disappeared over the groin.
Oh, no.
She didn't get hurt or anything, but that's how much of a difference it can make. And this was on a north-facing beach. It wasn't an ocean-facing
Well,
beach.
it depends on how strong your currents are and how much wind action and so on you have. But groins can have dramatic effects on beaches if they're not built properly, or even if they are built properly. The truth is, anything that interferes with the movement of sand can have effects downdrift that you might not be so crazy about.
Talking about jetties and currents, we have two jetties as you come into Nantucket Harbor, and they were built, well, I'm not sure, 7,500 years ago maybe, and they've, of course, settled over the generations, and sea level is slowly rising over the generations. So starting later this year, they're going to be repairing the jetties. Because at high tide, they just about disappear. When that happens, what might we expect to see in terms of currents and moving around of sand?
The jetties are typically used at the mouths of harbors to keep the harbor entrance clear, as is the case here.
Yes.
And what happens is they trap sand. And harbor jetties on inlets, that kind of thing, can be so good at trapping sand that they cause tremendous problems downdrift. And in a lot of places now, people want to move the sand that's trapped on one side of the harbor mouth to the other side of the harbor mouth. This is called sand bypassing. And people have a lot of ways of doing it, everything from building elaborate pumps and pipes and so on, to just loading the sand into a truck and physically driving it around to the other side of your harbor entrance. The success rate for sand bypassing is kind of mixed so far. In some places it works fairly well, but in other places people have had difficulty getting the systems up and running, and it can be disruptive because you normally want to do the bulk of your sand bypassing in good weather. which is when, the summer, the mild summer weather, which is when you have people who are most interested in using the beach. So there can be conflicts and arguments about when to do the kind of thing.
Let's shift tracks. How did you get into science journalism in the first place?
I wanted to be a journalist really all my life from childhood, from the time when I was too small to hold up the newspaper and read it. I had to put it on the living room floor and lie down and turn the pages. I have been in love with journalism from day one practically. And I worked at the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, which I went to school in Providence, and I went on to work at the paper. And then I eventually started teaching and thought I might like to teach, and I had been recruited by the Times and turned them down, which was considered stunning. But eventually I thought working at the Times would help me get a teaching job. So I went down to New York, and I was working on the national desk, and unbeknownst to me, there was a temporary opening in the science department, and someone had seen me in the newsroom with a copy of Scientific American. And on the strength of that, I got a call from my boss saying, on Monday, report to the science department. And people don't believe me when I tell that story, but it's literally the truth. That is exactly what happened. So I got to the science department and fell in love with it immediately, and things worked out, and they kept me there, and I stayed there basically the rest of my career, almost my entire career at the Times has been in the science department. And one day, I wrote a story about a proposal to build breakwaters in Palm Beach, Florida. And breakwaters, even though they're built parallel to the shore. Typically, they're blocks of rock, riprap, parallel to the shore, out in the water. And they attenuate the wave action. They slow down the water. They break the waves as they're coming in. So the water's moving more slowly, and the slower the water moves, the more sand precipitates out of it. So breakwaters are ways of trapping sand. They're like any other form of sand trapping. And so they cause the same kinds of problems downdrift as any other form of sand trapping. So I wrote it, but I didn't know any of that. So I wrote an article saying this proposal had been made and that everyone thought it was wonderful and it was going to do great things for the beaches of Palm Beach. And I got an outraged telephone call from a man named Orrin Pilkey, who is a coastal geologist at Duke. And he explained to me in no uncertain terms that everything I had said about this was just wrong, that I was completely ignorant about what was really going on the coast, and that it was a scandal that I could have written anything so wrong-headed in the New York Times. Then he said he was taking some students on a field trip at which all of these processes would be made clear. And so I said, may I go with you? And he let me come along with the students. And I subsequently went on a couple of Pilkey field trips and began to see what is actually happening on the coast. Once you get the idea in your head that the beach is a dynamic landscape and it wants to move around, and you start looking at it in those terms, you start to see things that you would not notice otherwise. I started noticing things, and I kept thinking someone should write a book about this, and nobody ever did. And then finally I wrote my book. But it was a long process.
You mentioned riprap. There's some on Nantucket, but those of us old enough to have taken the old Woods Hole ferry will remember that as you leave Woods Hole, there's a lot of riprap there. Now, you would still see it because you spend a lot of time on the vineyard.
There's a tremendous amount of riprap on the vineyard, unfortunately.
Tell us about our sister island and how what goes on there relates or doesn't relate to what happens here with erosion.
Well, I just took my class. I'm teaching a seminar that's called The Fate of the Coast. And it's what's the fate of the coast in an era of rising seas. And we went out to the vineyard, and I took them to a number of places where people have armored the coast years ago, and now those, not to mix metaphors, but those chickens are kind of coming home to roost. And there are places where there are walls, where there is not a beach anymore. One of the beaches is called the Inkwell in the town of Oak Bluffs, and it's kind of a culturally important beach because it was one of the places where people from the Harlem Renaissance who would vacation in Oak Bluffs, this was where they went to the beach. And so people care a lot about keeping this, not just because there are people today who are using it as a beach, but also because it was an important place in the nation's cultural history. Well, it's backed up against a wall, and they've tried to replenish it with sand. They got sand they thought would be good. It turned out to be very dark. It didn't work well. They eventually had to dig the sand that they put on up and remove it. That was not very good. There's a road that goes out to East Chop, also in Oak Bluffs. The bluff at the bottom of that road is slumping, even though it has riprap and so on at its base. That road is no longer a two-lane road. It's now a one-way street because the lane nearest the edge of the bluff is deemed too dangerous. There's another beach called Squibnocket, another famous beach. It's suffered terrible erosion. They have a parking lot there. They have to move the parking lot, but they don't have any good place to put it because the beach backs up on a marshy area. So there are problems like that, very, very common in any coastal area really, but those are some of them on the vineyard. Where I live on the vineyard, which is Chappaquiddick, the beaches are mostly managed by the Trustees of Reservations, which is a conservation organization.
They have land over here as
Yes.
well.
And they're the oldest land conservation organization in the world. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Or in
Really?
in the United States.
Really?
Yes. But they're modeled on the National Trust in Britain. But so they own or manage all this property, and it's not built on. So one of their big reservations is called Wasqui, which is at the far eastern end of Chappaquiddick. You can actually see on a clear day Tuckernuck. You can see Tuckernuck
Really?
from Wasqui, yes. In fact, that's a big sport. Is that Tuckernuck out there? But anyway, so it has undergone tremendous erosion in recent years. Hundreds of feet of beach lost. But it doesn't matter because the beach is fine. The beach responds to erosion by moving inland to higher ground and reforming itself. The beach does not require the protection that people keep putting on the beaches. It's the buildings that require the protection. Where there are no buildings, there is, in effect, no erosion problem. And now what's happening on Chappaquiddick, there was a barrier island, it breached, now it's moving around again because of the action of longshore drift, and now the sand is moving back out to the place on Wasqui where it eroded from at a tremendous clip. So this is another big sport of Chappaquiddick, is to say, what is this beach going to look like in 5 years? And I would say, I have no idea. It's going to be different from what it looks like today. But when you allow the beach to do what it wants to do, then you don't have an erosion problem. They have to keep, designating a new place to park your car, but that's not the end of the world for the trustees.
Well, the reason we caught you for this interview is you came over for the second year in a row to present at the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy's Coastal Erosion Forum. When you go back to Providence or Chappaquiddick, in addition to your work at Brown, what else will you be doing?
I write for the Times, and I have a long list of assignments that I want to complete. One of them is I've been wanting for years to do an article about ripple marks, which are those, they're ripple marks in the sand. You see them when the tide goes out. If
Yes.
they're very regular undulations in the sand, and their physics of ripple marks is imperfectly understood. And I am a big fan of any science story in which you have to say, we don't actually know what's going on here, especially when it has to do with something that's right under your feet, that you would think we would know everything about this, but
We recognize them and know nothing about them.
Well, I wouldn't say we know nothing, but we don't know enough. And ripple marks appear all over the place. They're on the surfaces of the moons of Saturn, anywhere where you have things that are subjected to wind or wave action. And They're granular. So that's a story I want to do. I'm working now on a story about the removal of a couple of dams from the Elwha River in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula. And dams, anything that keeps sand inland, is trapping sediment that's destined for the beach, just the way building a groin would do on the East Coast. So they took these dams out basically because they were interested in improving the conditions for the salmon. The dams heavily damaged the salmon run. But what happened was sediment that had been blocked by the dams is now moving out to the coast. And so the beaches on the coast of Washington State are growing again rather than eroding as they had been now that they don't have the presence of the dams. So that's a good news story, at least to me, that's a good news story. So I'm looking forward to writing that.
Cornelia Dean, thank you very much for doing this.
Oh.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for joining us. Please join us next time.